Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being on, particularly our honored guests who are, we're looking forward to expanding on all the good information that you already provided us. And I really encourage everyone to jump in with broad or narrow questions, because this is a very complicated topic and we want to get as much information as we can. And I'll turn it over to Sam.
Good. Well, thank you all again for being here. We look forward to sharing information. In the end, we're going to be looking for this group to help make some recommendations on how the plan implementation ought to be governed going forward. But right now, we're still in the listening and learning mode, so we appreciate everybody's participation.
All right, with that, I'd like to ask the panelists to really briefly introduce yourself. So that's your name, your organization. And I will, to avoid the awkwardness of who goes first, I'll go alphabetically. And so we'll start with Gabe.
Hi, I'm Gabe Filippelli. I'm a professor at IUPUI and I'm a co-chair of Reconnecting to Our Waterways.
All right, Dr. Indra Frank.
Hi, Indra Frank. I'm the Director of Environmental Health and Water Policy for the Hoosier Environmental Council.
Mr. Kevin Hardy.
Kevin Hardy. I serve as Executive Director for Friends of White River. Been with the organization as a founding member, former Board of Directors since 1985.
All right, John Hazlett.
John Hazlett, I'm the District Manager for the Marion County Soil and Water Conservation District. I'm also on the Board of Directors for Friends of White River.
Jill Hoffman.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jill Hoffman. I'm the Executive Director for the White River Alliance, and I've been in this position for, I guess, about 13 or so years.
All right, Tim Junk.
Hi, I'm Tim Junk. I'm with the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. I've been working in the environmental enforcement field for the last 30 years.
Tim Maloney.
There, Tim Maloney. I'm Senior Policy Director at the Hoosier Environmental Council.
And last but not least, Mr. Ryan Mueller.
Hi again, everybody. This is Ryan Miller. I'm Director of the Division of Water at the Department of Natural Resources, and we're likely one of many divisions within the department that will be engaging with this process. Thank you.
All right, with that, I'll turn it over to the team for questions and answers. And so we've all had a chance to review some of the written submissions from many on this panel, as well as some others. And hopefully that has triggered some questions. Would anyone like to start?
Brad, this is Emily. I have a question maybe that would just be helpful for some initial discussion. I'm certainly familiar with the organizations, both from the brief and just from reputation and their work in the community. But because I'm new to this process, I don't have a clear understanding of what type of coordination or communication already exists between these different entities. So maybe just as a starting question for those of you who've joined us this afternoon, if you could talk about how you already collaborate or coordinate, or what the communication looks like between the different organizations, that would be really helpful for my understanding.
Hey, Jill, or
yeah, I just
unmuted.
Start. It's always so awkward in these things to know who's supposed to speak. There needs to be a symbol. Well, I have the giant pleasure of having to work with a lot of folks on this call. So I would say, you know, sometimes we are divided by, organized by the areas we cover. So some of us are more localized, like Kevin and his efforts here in Marion County, us regionally, and Hoosier Environmental Council statewide. So in that sense, sometimes we're layering each other and helping bring different perspectives. And so we often talk together about different things that may come forward, whether that's legislation or a project or a spill or something like that. So I think you're seeing some different scales of perspective in the groups, and that might help understand how we work together or across each other's areas. But certainly, there's a number of us on this call that are involved with Partners for the White River, which is the Nina Mason Pulliam Charitable Trust's funding efforts around the White River. So in that sense, we all partner pretty tightly in the last handful of years on everything from communication messages to collaborative projects. So, you know, that we're often promoting each other's events or serving as guest speakers or experts for each other, be that at legislative testimony or in a public outreach event. So I would say the nonprofits, at least that are on this call, as well as Gabe and his work at the university, we're all in pretty close communication. I'm probably emailing with one of somebody on this call at least once a week. I'm sure others want to weigh in on that, I guess.
Hey, could I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
You know, I knew a number of you for various reasons prior to the Pulliam Partners program. I know that you probably worked together prior to the Pulliam Partners program. Do you feel that rapidly galvanized you more as a team? I mean, I'm just curious, or do you think that you pretty much had that communications network in place prior to that? And I'm just curious.
I would say I knew all of these folks. It's certainly stronger, in my opinion, since that effort. And that just has to do with us using shared metrics and having regular communication meetings and that kind of stuff. But I don't think I met any new partners through Pulliam's effort. We were connected, but not as integrated as we are. It's certainly been a lift in that regard. And then I would just maybe add, I realize that Ryan's on the call here. All of us work closely with the state agencies as well, whether that's permitting on projects or legislative type work, or Ryan and I are working on Central Indiana water study together with a group of other scientists. So in some ways, we end up crossing paths a lot. It's a small world on the environmental front. Kevin or Indra?
Yeah, does anyone from a state perspective want to chime in, either agency or Hoosier Environmental?
Well, actually, I think Jill expressed it very well, that I think all of the groups that are on this call have known each other for a long time. Through Partners for the White River, we've worked a lot more closely together over the last 3 years, and been more coordinated. Yeah, and it's true that Hoosier Environmental Council works statewide, but the White River has been a large part of our focus over the last 3 years as a member of Partners for the White River. And of course, some of the things that we do to influence environmental policy at the statewide level, of course, have an impact for the White River.
Yep. And this is Ryan. Since Jill had teed it up a little bit from the Division of Water standpoint, we obviously have a kind of a regulatory planning and technical assistance role statewide. So we see a wide variety of projects, whether it's in the White River Basin or other basins across the state. We also participate on several different basin development commissions, river basin commissions throughout the state as well. So we do have some experience with some of the governance aspects that are being discussed now. Beyond the Division of Water, of course, we have interests in public lands and state parks, our historic preservation efforts, our fish and wildlife efforts. So, you know, obviously I'm here representing the department, but we really have a wide variety of interests within the department, again, that I know of, have worked with lots of you on the phone if I haven't directly.
And this is John from the Marion County Soil and Water perspective. We do a lot of work with private property owners on drainage assistance and addressing erosion associated with streams and waterways. And I think that the technical knowledge that my staff has is often utilized by some of the partners on this call. I know Jill and I have worked together on a soil health pledge for her Clear Choices Clean Water program. And then more recently, I've been working a lot with Kevin Hardy on a stream steward guide for property owners. So just trying to embed the local technical knowledge that we have as an organization amongst my staff and utilizing that as a resource for various partners and their, I guess, their constituents or their members.
This is Kevin. Jill, as was pointed out, teed it up really well. We've all come to know each other better, I think, definitely through the Partners program. And I would characterize us as having overlapping interests, but not always completely shared audiences. The Partners program has allowed us to figure out how to better collectively have that voice. In the Friends case, we are more of a grassroots-based organization and probably have had our highest profile in terms of a watchdog role when some very negative things have happened to the river, but also as an advocate role in terms of showing its potential.
This is Tim Junk. I've sort of watched, I've not had an interaction with a lot of you, but I've been in the enforcement of environmental rules and regulations for the last 30 years. And if there's a role to play, I at least want to be there or be able to liaison to the agency, bring any agency resources that might be applicable.
I have another question, a follow-up question to that. So you've worked together before. The Partners program has kind of helped, organize, and I'm fascinated with Partners because I feel like it's an early indication of how a collective or a collaboration can move things forward, right? And obviously, I think your statement, I just copied it down, Kevin. It was so wonderful about you have overlapping interests, but not always shared audiences. And I just want to thank you all because the amount of effort and thought that went into your briefs was wonderful, by the way. I know the team feels the same way. They were really well done and just well thought out. In the Pulliam Partners program, I mean, obviously the White River Vision Plan has to be a little bit broader, right? It has to go to the stakeholders and some of them are involved in the Pulliam Partners project, but it has to include cities and municipalities, and it has to be a little bit more broader, which is what we're all wrestling with. And my favorite question on all of yours was, what scares you? That was my favorite question that you answered. And so, in thinking through your experience over the last few years with the Pulliam Partners, the work that you've done in advocacy and legislation, which I think is heroic, and also the work that you've done with sort of knitting together what you do, like you said, you're overlapping, but what do you think? What is it that would give you more strength? What is it that you need? What tool in your toolbox would be really helpful for you that you don't have now? Or tools?
I'd say a vehicle for more coordination in a structured format. Even though the Partners program has allowed us all to collaborate and to work together more, we were tasked with focusing on our individual areas of strength. I think for the general public, there's a little bit of confusion about everything that's out there. And I think if there is some type of structure that emerges as a voice for the river as a whole, and I'm not just talking about geography, but also about the composition of all the various people who utilize, enjoy, appreciate, or fear the river in one way or another. That would be helpful as long as we all have are in agreement that there's a unified message in that regard.
I'm gonna start
Brenda,
calling people. Okay, good, Jill.
It's a good question. It's funny. I like to use that question when I interview people for jobs too. Like, what scares you? Of course, the dog's gonna bark when I'm. Hang on. Unbelievable. She's quiet all morning until you guys hear from me. So I guess I would say I'm about to say something really important in the background of a dog barking, but our public officials are a tool that I feel like we need so much stronger leadership from them, and yet it's elusive about how to really grab their attention and commitment to the environment. It seems sometimes that, you know, these issues are polarizing or political, and I think the biggest tool I could have is, you know, and public officials turn over all the time, so this is a constant exercise, and it's a bit of asking us to think about how do we change the culture around environmental conversations to not be so divisive or fringe, and be more integrated into business conversation, into neighborhood development conversation, where if we could start to talk about the environment in a way that wasn't a leftist topic, that would be the one single biggest stride forward, in my opinion. You know, our organization is a bit different in that we have member organizations, and so a lot of our members are municipalities, and so that's because they use our programs to help meet their stormwater permit requirements, and they can unify under the umbrella of a nonprofit and raise other funds and these kinds of things. But I can be working with stormwater managers, and yet mayors or councils or zoning boards are seeing the world completely differently, or at least maybe in absence of some of the important information about what stabilizes their community in terms of, you know, health or resiliency or flood protection or quality of water, drinking water supplies. So I guess that's the tool I would love the most, is some way that we start to fully integrate the environment into these other conversations among people that are making really significant choices every day in their jobs as public officials, or even public, you know, staff planners and economic development folks and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Jill just said, and want to second it. And Brenda, that was an excellent question. You know, what tool would we most like to see? If we could see more of our elected officials at the local and state level have a clear understanding of the benefits of the healthy river and what keeps the river healthy, that would be huge. And along with that, they need the understanding that everything we do on the land affects the river, you know, within the area of the watershed.
So Andrew, you reference local and state. What about the feds? What are their roles? Both the elected as well as the agencies like EPA and Army Corps?
Well, of course, the federal environmental laws apply in Indiana and play a strong role. Both the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, waste handling laws. So those all play a role. Right now, Tim and I are both engaged in working on coal ash issues for the state and for all of our waters in the state that could be potentially impacted by coal ash. And part of that work has had to include weighing in as the EPA tries to weaken rules on coal ash handling.
This is John. From the district's perspective, we have a really strong relationship with NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service. And really over the past year, and I think this is really coming out of like the 2018 Farm Bill, that the Indiana NRCS offices seem to be better funded than they have been in a long time, both in terms of bringing new staff on board to meet local resource management challenges, and also just pumping money into actual programs like CRP and EQIP and some of their more traditional programs. And we're starting to see those programs get applied in more urban settings. And even now we're seeing a focus by them on urban agriculture and soil health. That's been a very solid partnership for us in the 2 years that I've been at the district. So I think making sure that the conversations about federal partnerships include them is really key. They're putting a lot of money into invasives management across the state as well through the Indiana Invasives Initiative. Of course, they promoted honeysuckle and autumn olive in the 80s, so it's sort of getting back to solving a problem they helped create. But I think that that's just a key player at the federal level.
So I have a question. One of the reports talked about some kind of a tax increment financing model that might be multi-county driven. And I'm not sure whose report that was, but with regards to funding, has this happened before? Has there been a TIF district with multiple counties involved, and has it been successful?
I think I was the one that suggested that, and I'm not aware of any example. I just had to think of some way that if we could increase the value of properties around the river, we could, finance that up front to make that happen. But it's not gone any further than I'm aware of, other than my comment in my response.
Yes. So Amy, TIF comes out of redevelopment law, which is tied to redevelopment commissions, and that Indianapolis is a little different than other places, but I think that would require individual redevelopment commissions establishing their own TIF district, and then some sort of MOA between them about funding, sharing, distribution, things like that.
I don't know enough about the regional legislation that went through, that didn't go through, right? It was.
So the Regional Development Authority language did go through. It did not include a funding mechanism.
So there's no funding mechanism, right?
This first step of that is something, and we will be hearing from some of the people involved in that at our
economic one.
Yep.
I think this ties in to a question that I had, and I, like Brenda, really appreciate the work that you all did, because I know this wasn't a lot of space to put all of the things that I'm sure you wanted to say in response to this, because this has got the potential to be such a really important benefit to the state on so many levels, and especially around the environment that we're talking about today. So this was really helpful. There was also a great deal of consistency between your responses, which was also incredible, because it allows us to really focus in on what the core areas of need are. And to almost a person or organization, one of the what are you scared about or what would not be helpful was additional bureaucracy and new red tape, new layers. And so when we think about a multi-jurisdiction TIF or comments frequently in the documents about the need for multi-jurisdiction zoning, or at least cooperation between jurisdictions around zoning, this is a very, very complex and tricky thing that we're trying to put together here, as you guys recognize more than most. If there was a place where this would sit in the scheme of federal, state, local county like a body of, or if it's private, where is it most valuable to sit to reduce bureaucracy? So that perhaps involves more complexity to it, but if it's of a state jurisdiction or if it's of a state body, what can it do from an authority standpoint to assist in your efforts versus being at an Indianapolis or Hamilton County or county level, or private? And what jurisdiction does it need to have to reduce the bureaucracy that you're talking about, to reduce layers? Is there a place where that would ideally sit for you from a state, local, private perspective to create the most value? And maybe another way to approach that, because I'm trying to think of as many ways, is an extra body almost by definition adds a layer. So are there layers that could come out, or layers that could be consolidated through this entity that would be useful in the process?
Well, I'll just jump in on this to get it started. Apart from having just a formalized collaboration process among existing bodies, say the local governments along the river, any kind of new governance structure is probably going to be another layer, and the part of the challenge is how do you do that without making it just a. There are models for regional work that exist across the state. One of the obvious ones for the White River would be a river basin commission. DNR can talk more about their experience with those. There are, regional councils of government, and I think Marion County and Hamilton County already are doing some of that. There are the metropolitan planning organizations that play a role in land use. If you look at the one in NERPC up in Northwest Indiana would be a model for a regional planning body that covers a lot of policy territory. So there are models out there, but any new body that you put together is going to come with an added layer. And how do you, if that's the choice, how do you do it without making it just more bureaucracy that has to be managed and navigated for the people who are doing work to protect the river?
Thanks, Tim. You were cutting off, your audio was cutting out a little bit during that, but are there other?
I think the entity needs to be seen as a champion, as a voice. I agree with what Tim said, that by the nature of having a governance entity, it's going to be a layer. And often when we use the term layer, we see that as a negative, but there's a lack of communication among some of those that Jill mentioned. Political considerations are by nature fiefdoms. And I think that if the message of the governmental entity, in this instance of the vision plan, is seen as positive, as seen as something that's of value, and that others are asked to say, yes, it is of value, and we're signing on to that, then it's actually a team builder, if you will. But again, that's coming from a grassroots perspective, because many of those who would consider themselves our audience or our membership do have a consistent fear oh, another layer of bureaucracy, another layer of government. This is my river. And I think the view of the river sometimes is narrowly defined by many. I know Brad used the term a quilt, and it's important to remember that a quilt has many panels to it. So I think that transparency is going to be really important for this process. I know that there's been a very significant amount of time devoted to having public meetings for the vision plan, but I think that there's still a lot of people, including elected officials, who don't know that at this point in time.
So let me throw something. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Joe.
Oh, I was just going to build a little bit and then on what Kevin was saying. In terms of, I think it's really important how you start this out the door in terms of whether it feels like bureaucracy or it feels like opportunity. You know, when I look at our regional MS4 program that we started, you know, in 2009, you know, we brought these cities and towns together and it seemed impossible, except they all had the same need to meet these permit requirements and nobody had enough funding to do it and nobody really had any good ideas. So, you know, we still years later are running that with simple 2-page MOUs. And what they quickly realized was that they were going to be able to leverage each other's money. And that doesn't happen in municipalities or across municipal boundaries very often because you have to spend money in the place where you took the money from. But pooling it into a collective program and then allowing another entity, whether it's a nonprofit or a river basin commission, to supplement that with funds smells a lot more like an opportunity than red tape. So I think, you know, that we run that program with letting those communities set the work plan every year so they still feel like they have control over where we're headed. And then what they've done is, you know, and every given year are bringing back somewhere between 10 and 40% return on their dollar by participating in that umbrella program. So sometimes I think it might be both the way we talk about what, you know, cooperative ideas feel like instead of bureaucracy, how we frame them, and then how we deliver them in terms of who scripts what happens and what kind of additional funding becomes available when you add this other layer in. It doesn't feel like a layer, it feels more like a window.
And Tim, you had a very interesting comment in your brief, kind of the perverse nature of if we regularly have tax money coming in or public money coming in, that could fracture the consensus because everyone's fighting for their piece of it. And as Jill mentioned, it's coming from Hamilton County, this should be our piece of it. And you have that happening at every level. Then you also reference the opportunity that if we have to collaboratively come together to find resources, that kind of forces cooperation. And Jill, that's kind of what you just mentioned. That,
Brad, I'd like to follow up on that if I could. And Tim mentioned this, and Betsy, this again is not getting away from the layer that you're talking about, but there was some legislation, pretty effective legislation in my opinion, that passed several years ago for the Kankakee and Yellow River Basin Development Commission. I actually sit on that commission as a member, and a lot of what Brad just said, in the former River Basin Commission, each county would pay in, each county expected their piece to come back. After this new commission was reconstituted, they really did have that common mission Jill had mentioned, which in this case was reducing erosion and sedimentation, flood risk reduction, and those types of things that were symptoms of a larger problem throughout the basin. One of the unique parts of this new commission is that they actually added an annual assessment of different types of properties within the basin. So if you're a agricultural producer, you were paying $1 per acre annually into this assessment. If you were a homeowner, you paid a certain amount. If you're a business owner, you paid a certain amount. Now, that was pre-COVID, and so obviously we're in a different time frame, but In the less than a year I've been associated with this new River Basin Commission, they've really made positive strides. And so that might be a model just to consider as you move forward. I know this is a smaller section of river. The new River Basin Commission up north encompasses the entire basin. But again, the whole concept of finding that common need, pooling resources, making a consensus-based decision. So far, that's been working in the Kankakee. So just for what that's worth.
Really helpful.
Ryan, could you speak to the consensus decision? Where do the decisions lie on and actual actions? Does that lie with the commission?
Yes. So the commission is made up of appointed members from each county within the basin, plus one member from the Department of Natural Resources. And so that would be me. Those issues are brought forward to the commission. They're heard, they're debated, and then votes are actually taken in a public commission meeting. So all of those actions are voted on, and that the transparency, I think, again, is really key. So there are monthly meetings where these issues are brought forward. Those minutes are posted following the meetings. So that's, I don't know, did that answer the question, Matt?
Yeah, very much, and maybe I'll follow up on that. If there's a structure of this separate regional governing body, if you will, in decisions lie then with that group, so that imagine everyone and all the constituents on this call can provide input and bring issues, but would you be comfortable with a structure where you're abdicating decision-making on actions relative to the river to this group? Because that by its very nature cuts down on bureaucracy, but it reduces vote, if you will, and becomes more of an input that's based off of the commonality that's established up front.
Matt, one of the important things I forgot to mention is that part of this commission is also a technical advisory committee. And that is made up with folks very much like the stakeholders that are on the phone now. And so a lot of times the commission will, for lack of a better term, kick an issue to the technical advisory committee and ask for the committee to make recommendations that come back to the full commission for a vote. So it doesn't cut out the planning function that's been going on here with this group. In my mind, it enhances it a little bit. But what this commission envisions is that you don't have 30 commissioners making decisions. You have a more small representative body making those decisions so you can reach consensus, but it draws upon the recommendations and the technical expertise of that other committee. Now, this sounds awful bureaucratic, again, sorry, but so far it's worked pretty well up there.
It's helpful. In that
I would add, actually, to that point, if you don't mind, Ryan, I would say that that's a critical part of this. I mean, you need expert advice on some of these issues, right? It can't be all driven by pure economics, because we know the environment's never been priced into the economics of anything. It should be, but it's not. So it really does require not only, and maybe this makes something too big, but not only the expert advice from a technical committee, for example, but some community representation. I know technically the county commissioners are that, but that actually there's so many layers above the folks who are impacted on the ground by some of these decisions, that it would be great if that was at least one component of decision making.
And that's a question that I had all along. So we have studied Kankakee and river development commissions and basin commissions in some other states, and most of them lack any official role for the public. There's obviously public meetings and things, but what is the role of the general public? What is the role of a neighborhood leader, formally or informally, in this type of initiative?
So, sorry, Brad, I was muted talking, a la Jill. So the role, at least of the public within the current Kankakee and Yellow River Basin Commission, is I would say somewhat limited. Some of the public do participate on the technical advisory committee. Again, the old KRBC prior to this reconstitution was frankly too big and unwieldy, and nothing ever really got accomplished. So this new commission kind of pared down the numbers. The public has an opportunity to provide comment during each one of the monthly meetings, to provide written comment, but that's been the limit so far. Now, what we're talking about up in the Kankakee is something that the public is very much asking for too, which was, restoring the hydrology of the river so that you're reducing flood risk reduction. So that message is kind of, passed through all the commission members, all the technical advisory committee members, and so the public has been, relatively speaking, pretty well aligned with the commission up there. Now, that may or may not be the case here, but at least up there, that's what it's been. So to wrap it up, it's limited, but at least it's been consistent so far with the directions the commission's moving.
Yeah, I'd like to weigh in, Brad, maybe not so much on the answer to your question, but this earlier question about, would all of us feel comfortable, I think the word was like forfeiting or something to some representative. And I think that the challenge there is that, doing a river related thing, this is hard science, which is also sometimes not an element of other maybe tourism or redevelopment initiatives, where there's a whole set of things that require a deep bench of technical experts to understand. And I guess what I would just caution is that maybe this idea of a technical advisory committee could help with some of that. But what I've seen happen before is when the physical environment is given one seat on a commission to be representative. And oftentimes I see, Hoosier Environmental Council get asked to play that role, or in this case, recently I did it with the stormwater permits. You're one voice among so many other stakeholders, and yet you're the voice that allows the physical health and safety of a community to be heard. But it's just one voice and quickly gets outvoted if there is, a whole bunch of other people at the table. So I guess, this is the environmental call that we're, I guess I would just caution about that representative government kind of style thing happening, that forefront is always the river itself. And I don't mean that from a pie in the sky, perfectly clean water ecology stuff, but I mean the force of the river and flooding and uncovering landfills like we're seeing happen in Hamilton County. And, there's some very serious technical issues that warrant more than one voice on a commission. So somehow, as you're thinking this through, while I feel often very comfortable looking around this call and saying, I'd let Indra talk for me, I'd let John Hazlett speak for me. I mean, when you said there was consensus on our responses, I think that's because we all understand these issues, but it doesn't mean that they often get the ranking that they warrant relative to everything else. So as you think about putting in new developments or rezoning things, or creating opportunity, there's a physical force of both water movement, its instability, and its gigantic pollution load that warrant somebody to look hard at every single idea that comes before this group with not just the lens of a biologist or a geologist or a hydrologist, but a public health expert and on and on. So somewhere elevating the importance seems to be, to me, would be important in that structure before I would feel super comfortable with that idea that I think Matt mentioned of forfeiting a voice to somebody. I would forfeit a voice to many voices. That would be okay.
All right, so we have
My
about
question,
15 minutes left.
Brad.
Yep.
My question to the group is, is there an existing organization that could be tasked with the governance of the plan going forward? Is there someone that already has a broad enough constituency, a broad enough audience, and a trust and respected reputation that they could do it?
Maybe while thinking about that, because added on is, if they exist today, why haven't they been successful in being able to create what we're talking about here? So if there is an organization, to Sam's question, that makes sense to do that, what have been the barriers to success for that organization that would have to be solved?
And point of clarification, Sam, are you speaking for the environmental perspective or the much broader environmental, social, economic perspective of the plan?
Just, I guess you could include all of that in thinking. Is there some existing entity, either represented here today or not represented here today, that could be tasked with governing the vision going forward, with either some modifications or removing of barriers that maybe they face that limits their ability to do it today?
My thought was that was what we were exploring during this phase of the vision plan process.
I think it is, Kevin. It's just, like, two of you have White River in your name, right? Or so I think he's asking, and I thought that Brad's question was really good because, obviously some of you focus, like Jill focuses more on science and advocacy in that area, and and I think Betsy asked, how could you make adaptations, right, to become a more broad-based? I mean, it's okay to speak up for yourself, or it's okay to think in terms of, because I think I know that Jill works with local government on, stormwater, wastewater, and all these other things. But it's a good question. Just answer.
Well, and I think if you take a look at the collective discussion in the plan itself, that one of the challenges that we recognized in this is that we, through the regional vision plan, we're trying to create a bigger tent, and that bigger tent means greater democracy, and the greater democracy becomes the debate we're having right now. And there are differences and nuances. Those core values that were defined by the community are kind of the anchors that we worry about, to help us define what progress has to be able to meet the minimum standard of around those core values. So the question is, and I think it does get to this, is one is, do you create a new entity that tries to do all this, which sounds complicated for all the reasons legitimately that are being discussed, but is there also a modification of something that has already existed? And just to throw it out, the White River State Park Commission, or because ultimately there is an authority that comes from the state and works its way down to the local, and you've got to figure out how you coordinate and correlate all of that power with those guiding principles and all those different agencies and entities. Is it easier to pick apart, like Sam, what you were suggesting in terms of something that's worked either to elevate its brand to an awareness, but it hasn't worked perfectly because it's either been underutilized, not fully at capacity, or it's failed miserably because of its construction. I think that helps dial this in a little bit.
This is Brian Payne. I have a question about this. So we're going to want to get a lot of philanthropic dollars put into this process, right? We're going to want foundations and individuals and corporations to give money. In my career, I've always noticed that there's a big correlation to people giving money to people who they trust, who are ultimately in charge, right? So people give money to not-for-profits because they believe in the leadership as well as the vision or the mission. It's both. So they're giving to people, leaders, as well as missions. And like, I'll give you an example. So we have a women's fund, probably the most successful women's fund in all of America at CICF. That's part of CICF, but we make sure that the very dynamic women's fund board, though it's legally an advisory board, we make sure they have an incredible amount of authority and decision making, and it's really they're in charge. Our board and I stay hands off, and we let the Women's Fund Board really be in charge because those people are giving money, and they have to feel really connected, and they have to feel like their vision and their leadership matters. And it does, because we get all the bureaucracy out of the way and let them be the leaders, not let them, just create the environment in which they really are the leaders. If they were an advisory fund and not the real board, if they were an advisory board, they have to act like an advisory board. Legally, they are. But if we made them act like one, the amount of philanthropic support would be pennies on the dollar. So I wonder, a lot of times these government agencies with commissions aren't looking for the people other than maybe around the fringes of a friends group to give a few dollars here and there. They're not looking for significant philanthropic support. So that works from that perspective. But if we want a lot of people to give a lot of money, there's going to need to be passionate people on that board that represent those philanthropists in a way.
I have a question. Great comment, Brian. And we have thought of this, right? Is there a way to do a hybrid? Again, how many layers can you have? Right? Is because we want to meet both, but that's been tossed around, and Brad can do a better job of explaining this than I can. But this idea of understanding that there have to be, we know that there are people who are passionate about the river and water ecology and the environment who might be willing to give, and we certainly know there's foundations. I mean, look at Polium and what they've done, and we know other interest exists in the city and out there. But we have to feel like, how are we going to deal with this whole government side, right? We have to also be heavily involved. So what would a hybrid look like? Would it be an existing organization with another arm? And
well, Matt's mentioning of the White River State Park Commission, I think is kind of an interesting one. I think that one works pretty well. And I don't know how everyone gets appointed, but there are people who are passionate about placemaking and parks, and the White River on that commission who bring resources because they're passionate. So there at least is a room of, it's not, if it's all political appointees, and I don't know how many are and who has the appointees on the White River. I certainly know that the governor gets to appoint the chair, but there seems to be, if it really is all politically appointed, the political appointing authorities are doing a pretty good job of getting people who are passionate about that. And it's not just, doesn't seem like just who gave money to the governor to get on that commission. There are people who are really bringing a lot of focus and passion to the White River State Park. So that might, from that perspective, is there something that fulfills the state regulatory needs that the appointing authorities give plenty of room, or maybe that there's, some are appointed and some the board gets to self-select And so that is, you know, people who represent the state and the state's interests, but also people who are passionate philanthropists and represent the community's interests. And maybe that's a model to look at.
Just to jump in real quick, this is Ryan. Kind of along those lines, Brian, is what you were just talking about on the Kankakee River Basin Commission. Actually, 2 of the commissioners are local farmers in the area. It's not all governmental entities. And so when you were asking the question earlier about, you know, the public's representation, the fact that there are 2 farmers who live and work within the basin up there and represent a lot of the interests, that provided a lot of credibility for the commission. Now, you know, that's kind of, I don't know if that analogy lines up with what you're talking about, but it's got that similar flavor.
So I have an expectation-based question. You know, there's a wide spectrum of authority that can be given to a governance body, or what people will allow the governance body to have. You could say that the more authority given, which is unlikely given you have to work through the political entities, but the more authority given, the faster you can move. Obviously, the right way to do that is make sure that everybody in the community, all parties, are along for are part of that ride, and that you're not using your authority in a manner that is completely inappropriate, right? So I'm going to think very positively and assume that the governance body is going to have all of the right interests in mind based on the principles of the White River Plan, and that we'll find the way to put whatever the articles of incorporation need to be to ensure that, for example, to your point, Jill, it's not just one voice at the table that is an appointee for the environment, but that it is an embedded part of the decision-making structure. But what is the pace that you would like to see something like this move, given you all sit in the reality of just generally slow-moving, very difficult processes in many cases? More authority means you can move faster. Less authority, like if there's no multi-jurisdictional authority on zoning, if there's not broad taxing capability or bonding authority, then funding is reliant on philanthropy and other private donors, which creates a different shift, highly possible, but a shift, or mix, I should say. So in an ideal situation, what's the pace that you would see this move? And to do that, are there certain authorities you would give to this body to allow it to move that quickly? Assuming the best of intentions in this. So I want to start from if you have your ideal situation and the intention and the environment, it's very well taken care of and an integral part of all decision making. Start there and we can move back to the much more cynical and perhaps realistic component. But in the ideal situation, what does that look like?
Never know when to jump in here, but I could say I guess I see 2 things in that regard. We can't move fast enough on protective measures, and we maybe can't move or shouldn't move that fast on development measures, right? But I think we all know, those of us in the environment space, it is really hard to undo the obliteration of critical environmental green infrastructure. So when we take out a wetland or we fill in a floodplain, undoing that is years and millions in the making. So if there's anything to think about from an authority standpoint that could or should move quicker than another, it might be to get some of these legal entities on board about protective measures. So we know climate change is bringing us a lot more water faster, which creates a lot of problems for this whole thing going forward. So stop gapping our stormwater management practices is something that could and should be done pretty quickly. Protecting some of these key green infrastructure pieces that exist is something that, you know, could and should be done quickly. These other projects obviously warrant a lot more thoughtful consideration when you're talking about investments and in impacts to neighborhoods and those kind of things. So I think the pace might depend on the topic, at least from my perspective.
I'd like to make a thought, you know, I think the science of the river, Brad and I talked with a reporter at the IBJ, just wanted to be backgrounded on this process yesterday. And, you know, I thought a lot about that, you know, so I think the science of the river and the ecology, what you've just mentioned, is critically important. And I think anybody who's lives through a spring anymore in Indiana fully understands that. Ask the farmers. But yet we're really heavily involved in branding or lifting up the river, because I feel there's just still too much apathy out there. You know, there's just too much. I mean, even though I think you all have done a heroic job, don't get me wrong, there's just not been enough money in the world, right, to get the messaging out there that it takes to get. We need people to care, because then they will push up, you know, they will push their elected officials, these public officials, into caring. And so that's where I constantly wrestle with this idea that the three pillars there's the three pillars in the plan: the environment, you know, access or equity, and help me. Thank you, economy. And thank you. I have started to go try to be alliterative and do all E's, but you know, and I constantly stress. It's a very good question, Betsy. Is which one goes? I mean, they're almost all going to have to go out of the gate at the same time. Does that make sense? And that's the conundrum. But I just thought I would make that comment, because I think you were so correct, Jill. I mean, you know, ever since this process has occurred, I've never driven by a wetlands and thought of it the same way again. You know, I mean, you just think about the river so totally differently after we go to your conferences, or we take a float trip with Kevin. And we need to get everybody to get there, and how we do that, and because then they will push up to those elected officials. And we do have an elected official on the phone. Aaron is on the phone from Noblesville, but he cares deeply about the river. But anyhow.
Councilor Osley.
That's right, Councilor Osley's on the phone. Sorry.
Was on earlier. He had
he was. Okay.
But just point of order, we've reached the hour scheduled for the panel. We had on the agenda, we have 30 minutes of discussion just between the team. But I'll entertain, you know, the chairs, whether you want to keep the panel going, or whether you do want to use that 30 minutes of internal discussion time.
I'd like to get to the separate discussion, but if I could, I'd like to ask one kind of around the horn, very open question, and ask everybody to respond very quickly, each of you individually, that on our panelists. And so my question comes from an environment, the river and the environmental standpoint, thinking of what is your definition of what is a healthy river. What is one thing that it should happen for sure, that when we were done with this, we would have definitely done a kind of as tangible as possible. And one thing that at the end of it, you would say we should have never have done, should never happen. It's kind of the low-hanging fruit on what's most important and what shouldn't happen. And Jill, you're always willing to jump in. So, and you're taking notes, so I'm going to ask you if you wouldn't mind starting on that, and everybody keep it to about a minute.
Shoot, I was hoping I could be quiet. I felt like I was talking too much. It happens. Also not having a lot of time to process that. One thing I think that I guess we just should have done is elevate the status of this river in our community. It's something we're hoping to do with some of our Pulliam funding, but there's not probably enough there to talk about the value of water to our community. I mean, those three pillars, Brenda, all fall apart without it. It's foundational to every single business and our public health, and then these environmental respite things. So that the straight up elevation of that into every conversation, as if it's the thing that we protect the most when we're talking about community development or we're talking about economic development. that would be the thing I think we could win the most on, is just to everybody understand its critical value. And I guess the thing we should not do, maybe I'm stealing this from Gabe, is underestimate climate change. And as we're planning for this thing, know that we have a flashy and dynamic system, and we currently are piping lots of things to it with very little protection of infiltration. So just one thing we should not do is underestimate our need to think about that water cycle as we're planning for this thing.
Thank you. On my screen, Kevin, you're next.
Okay, well, I echo what Jill has said, but in a different way. One of the terms that I use for the river is natural infrastructure. It's something that is here. It took millions of years to build. And I believe that there is that general lack of awareness among not just the public, but many of those who are tied to it via elective office. So I think that this body needs to create, it needs to get beyond the word consensus, but this very broad-based support that this is important. It's something that needs to be done now. I think if something doesn't happen that is perceived as part of the vision plan in the course of the next year, there's going to be an incredible loss of traction or a feeling that, well, this is just another document that's on the shelf. So I think that there needs to be establishment of some type of body with the awareness that that body is going to evolve and grow. We've all had to do that as organizations.
Thank you. Indra?
Well, yeah, thank you for the question. The first thing that came to my mind that I hope this vision plan implementing body will do is respect the floodplain of the river and the space that the river needs. And then of course, paired with that, the thing I would not want to happen is creating any new buildings or levees that interfere with the function of the floodplain.
Thank you. Tim?
Thanks, Matt. I would certainly echo what Jill said about the river being at the top of community consideration as a critical community asset. And I'd also add to that it needs to be not just in word, but in deed. And part of that, the deeds would be funding, making sure that the White River Vision Plan and the programs related to the river have adequate resources to get the job done. And there's this old saying that don't tell me what is important to you. Show me your budget, and I'll tell you what's important to you. And so I think that should be reflected with the river.
Thank you. Sorry, Tim Junk.
The only thing that comes to my mind is the more we can bring people down to the river to see it, to recreate, and to want to do that, the more public interest we're going to have, and donations and everything else.
Thank you. Ryan?
Just kind of largely echoing what everyone else said, I think connectedness, not only the river to the floodplain, but the people to the river and the people to the plan. So that's easier said than done, but connectedness is, I think, very important. Agreeing with Jill and Indra both, we can't rely on past precip, past events moving forward. I think we all know that notion of stationarity is gone. I don't know if we really know yet what we're in for. There's definitely a lot of models looking at more water over a shorter period of time, followed by extensive periods of drought. So I think that fluctuations on the river. Jill mentioned flashy. I think that's definitely what we're in for. And I think any planning along the river needs to be very thoughtful, obviously, and not increase flood risk, not decrease the connectiveness between the river and the floodplain.
Thank you. Gabe?
Well, it's nice to go toward the end because a lot of smart people have said all the good stuff. I think the most important thing is to recognize that this river is actually a system of waterways. It's a part of an entire system that flows through everyone's communities. And so as such, it's a resource that we should all value. And probably the worst thing we've done is, is using our rivers as a sewer. That's one bad thing. But it's kind of under managing them as if they're not a natural resource, managing them as if they're an engineered resource instead of something that is more dynamic than it actually, than we actually take in account.
Great. I think, John, you're our last panelist.
Yeah, I was going to follow along with what Indra was saying about reconnecting to the floodplain and making sure that stream setbacks for new development are respected and that there are not variances granted in these various counties where I think we're trying to embrace the river, but we need to be mindful of giving it room as well, and that there's not inconsistencies across the various counties for allowing development requiring certain setbacks from the stream.
Thanks. That's very helpful to me. I'll turn it back to Sam and then Brad to facilitate what's next.
All right, so thank you, panelists. We definitely appreciate the time that you've provided today, as well as those of you who submitted the written briefs. If we have additional questions, we will certainly be in touch. You guys are our panel of experts for the environment, and so we greatly value your time. And so you're welcome to stay on in kind of listen-only mode. This is being recorded and will be posted publicly to mywhiteriver.com. But if you need to get going, take off. Thank you for your time. We'll see you later, and we'll go into discussion mode with the team members. All right, so key takeaways. I guess I'd like to go around, we'll start with Brenda. Go around and kind of some key.
Make me laugh.
Make you laugh. Some key takeaways, key things you learned, or some key questions that this conversation established for you.
Emily, I can't hear you.
I was on mute, sorry.
Sorry.
I'm happy to start and maybe share kind of two observations that struck me throughout the course of the conversation. And I appreciated certainly in the brief to the emphasis on science in terms of helping guide any decisions that are made. And coming into this from an outside perspective, I think I've been surprised just over the course of this conversation how much that was elevated as a concern going forward from the panelists that we heard from today. And I think it's because I just assumed from like a value perspective that would be integrated into whatever governance structure is established. And so it seems like there's a really high concern for elevating science and making science-based decisions that it almost feels like it's somewhat misplaced from my perspective, if that's part of how the organization is formed. So just seeing that as a takeaway. I think the other thing that really came through to me through this is there are a lot of informal structures for coordination right now, but there isn't a formal structure in terms of how these groups are collaborating. And so I think that there's a lot to build on, but I think that absence of a formal structure, which is known, but came through pretty loudly today too.
All right. That's the reason I asked the question about the partners, because I think that was the first time there had been any formal structure, right? Am I right? Those of you, there been row, but I mean from a regional perspective, and I think that's been very successful, but it is still not, I mean, David and the team would be the first to tell you that it is not by no means a formal structure. Probably the communications team is the most formal part of that structure, but they do have a shared set of metrics, which I think has been really helpful for them. But there are humanities people in that partnership, and there are science people, right? I mean, there are just such a wide spectrum, and certainly the same would be true from viewpoints for us as well. But I think the core mission would be a little more cohesive. Yeah.
Yeah, the part that I couldn't quite figure out from this is is it embedded in a governance structure, or is it in kind of the managing documents of the governance structure? Because I took Jill's point to heart about having one person appointed from the environmental side doesn't solve the problem. It can be a voice that's really overweighted in the structure. So just in terms of both who gets appointed to the group, or however that ends up working, is one component, but there's obviously also this deeper, I don't know what the rules of engagement are for the organization that probably, and I would say we have to develop those now, it seems like, as well as the type of legal entity that we're talking about, types of funding streams that need to come, or ways that money needs to be distributed. It sounds like this is a component that also needs to be developed along with that, so that the parties that are deeply involved and interested in this process understand the rules of engagement, and that they're written and that they're committed to. I mean, even in kind of the 16 text structure, when we were developing that, some of those weren't written down, although we said the same things every time. Lots of assumptions were made until we had them written down, and then there was a commitment. But we couldn't necessarily have a board that included every single voice in the way that everybody wanted. We're going to run into the same challenge here, that you can't have enough seats unless you have a Congress.
I guess one of the two things struck me. One, the concept of this as a natural resource and as a real living, breathing part of our communities and our states, and should be handled with care. So that was one big piece that we have to remember in our governance of whatever decisions made. The second piece that really struck me was the question that Betsy asked about how quickly would you be willing to move, or how much you prioritize what would happen. And I believe that we are headed into a much more environmentally sensitive time period than we have been before as a nation and as a Midwestern industrial state. And when I think about what does it look like when we end up, there's no reason that participation in working along the waterway doesn't have to meet all of those cylinders. You know, the environmental side, the economic development side, to be able to say, if you've met this criteria, we're willing to talk to you and we're willing to authorize your participation. But you know what? If you haven't paid attention to watersheds, you haven't paid attention to, do you have a clean environmental history? If you haven't gone this direction, you're going to have to go over here in the work your plan out committee. So I guess if we look forward progressively as a progressive city, not what barriers are there that we can't get done, what expectations do we set before anyone who wants to play along that space weighs in and has to demonstrate their former economic development, their former history of inclusion? Is there a checkbox for the inclusion and equity teams that say, okay, you know what? We've wanted to fish in this area for a super long time, and we'd like to talk about how that could work. So what struck me was I do believe there is cohesion among those partners in what they prepared in their written work and what they articulated today. And I think that we should not undersell this forward momentum of doing things well for the long run. I think as a region, we are much wiser stewards of our natural resources than we may have been in the booming industrial era of who we became as a state.
Following up on what Amy just said, I really like what I like what all of you said, but especially Amy. I came away with a much greater sense of just of the science and the healthy ecological priority of the river than I did coming into this meeting. I mean, I've always known it's important, but even a greater sense of importance. Probably on the balance between developing cool things for people versus the health of the river. I've always been a little bit more on the develop cool things for people side, and now we've got to find the right balance on that. And I was struck by, I think it was Jill who said that, just when you do destruction to the health of the river, it takes decades and millions to undo the bad thing that you did, and so we have to get ahead of that. At the same time, I think who gets to set the principles of engagement. If it went into if we create a governing board, and the governing board that somehow gets appointed, then if they get to set the governing principles, that might be a miss. I mean, I don't know that we have the authority to do it here, but we need to stand up what the principles are and then recruit toward those principles, not just recruit and let them come up with the principles. Because already we've done, just in these two meetings, and with all the great work that Brad and I mean, so many people have done. There's a group, not just us on this phone right now, but on the Zoom right now, but there's a group of people who've done a lot of work on this to get the planners, the experts on the planning, Brenda and others. We need to capture that. We can't start over with like an appointed group or even an elected group of board members and say, okay, now figure it out. We've got to recruit the governing board according to the principles that get set up by the experts.
Yeah, very true, Brian. I think there's when we decide on what we're going to shoot for here from a governance entity, we'll have a better picture on what is needed to substantiate buy-in to that. And I agree. Ultimately, we're looking to establish a governance entity that needs to do just what you're talking about. There has to be something that they are very much empowered to do and do it in a sustainable fashion.
Sorry to jump back in here, but one of the things I wanted to comment on Amy said is this idea that that coming out of, maybe it's COVID, I think it is COVID, I think there's going to be a greater sense of prioritizing resilience in our country and in the world. And certainly I think, climate resilience is going to be is going to get a higher level of discussion, because we've just seen how we're not being very resilient to a pandemic. And so what do we need to be prepared to be resilient for as communities and as a society and as a country? I think resilience is going to become way more prized and a bigger priority. And then that's a theme that will underlie a lot of different things, including our river resilience and our flood resilience, and just the healthy nature of our own ecology. I mean, working on the cultural trail, I never was able to talk about any environmental positives of the cultural trail until after Katrina happened in New Orleans. And then even we in Indianapolis got the importance of, wow, there seems to be something going on with the environment in this country. And I could start pitching environmental and ecological benefits of the cultural trail as a fundraising mechanism. But it was only after Katrina kind of woke people up to a certain degree. And I think this is going to wake people up, I hope.
The thing that should have been earlier probably, but when we're talking about the White River is natural infrastructure, and you just sort of play sort of the mind games of, boy, what if we didn't have it? You know, or what if it gets destroyed? What if it's not taken care of? And we just don't elevate it to the status that it really deserves? And so as we look at governance, we want to make sure that that governance does play a role in elevating the status of the White River as that natural infrastructure that without it, our community would be dramatically different.
You know,
in a negative way.
Absolutely. Did you read Jill's comments on her? I mean, I've heard her speak before on this, but you know how sometimes it just really hits you home. I mean, hits home, and the number of people that tap into this river. I do think it's going to be, to your point of resilience. I mean, this is going to be a thoughtful issue for a long, I mean, these are going to be big discussions, Brian, right? These are huge things, right, Sam? I mean, they're going to be, and we have 100, she said there were 150 different taps into the river, different well structures. And I mean, that's significant.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the takeaways I had was just,
I doubt most elected officials. Go ahead, Matt.
No, I think that one of the things that's important, and I appreciate it, and Amy, you brought it up too, in terms of the natural resource. You know, water, air, and land are the only three things we can't really produce as much as we'd like to think we can, and they're the most critical to our economic infrastructure in terms of our ability to sustain. And one of the things we learned is that in addition to how we treat the water is how we allow the water to exit our state. It's either taken early or it's not used at all, and we don't fully understand that impact. And it really is in that balance. I think one of the challenges in governance we have is that what we learned was economy's the most powerful, environment's probably the most combative. I mean, I think that, Amy, I think you're right. We're onto a period of where we're going to better understand it. And the equity is the most neglected. And so I think that ability to power and balance those three difficult realities. And yet I know how many times in our conversations early on, we talked about, we can do whatever we want, but the Army Corps of Engineers ultimately is going to have an unusually sized response. And they don't even have an office in the state of Indiana. The closest one is Louisville. So I think that as we talk about the governance, there are just some realities that the state's got to play in this. The state's not going to let us create something different that is going to be difficult for them to see scale across the state on all the other waterways. So I think we have to have that ability to look at the macro and the micro level, and I think those guiding principles. But the one that does bother me that is how do you address the science? And I think if you look in the state legislature, as we've watched bills get introduced, economy trumps science almost every time. Economy trumps equity almost every time. And how do we find that balance and representation that makes that checklist available? And Amy, you referenced that. So I think that's going to be the challenge in the charter.
Especially since the economy's down, you know, since the economy's devastated, it's going to be harder to hold off those voices that the economy always needs to come first.
Well, but Brian, it might be easier because for the first time we've seen the vulnerability of how science can kill the economy.
Another small mention, and maybe it's something to be optimistic about, and is that, well, first, in reading the brief, I was surprised that so many of the respondents acknowledged that shifting the perception of the river as a place for recreation was a very big barrier. And I know just from a 16 Tech perspective how excited people are to activate the riverfront right there, the intersection of Fall Creek and White River, and to utilize it. So I was somewhat surprised to hear that, see that as mentioned frequently as a barrier, but also, as we talk about some of these post-COVID realities in the world that we might be in for the foreseeable future, we're increasingly seeing organizations, both in the private sector and some trends from the public sector when thinking about the importance of green spaces. The idea that your green space becomes your primary space of collaboration because it might be safer than having people in a small room together. So I think there's some things that I think bode well towards increasing the importance of the asset and how people might think about using it, just in light of some of the issues that we're all facing today too.
I hate to cut off good conversation, but I do want to be cognizant you're all very important, busy people. So I just want to talk a little bit about next steps and then turn it over to Matt and Sam to close. But we do have the next 2 panel meetings scheduled, so you should have calendar invites for those. The briefs have been requested from a bunch of stakeholders, and so you'll receive those 2 weeks prior to each of those meetings. Yeah, that's next steps. Matt and Sam?
Sam, you're on mute.
I just want to say thanks to all of you, and if you have other thoughts and comments, please give them to Brad, and Brad will get them to all of us.
Yep. Brad, thanks for the facilitation, all the good commentary today. And one takeaway for me that was great was the group really embraced needing leadership, needs this group, this whatever we're going to come up with. They need it. They want it. And they recognize the value of it. They're not. It doesn't seem like there's a fight against the concept. So we just got to work through the details. But it was really good to hear. Everybody wants leadership, so we got to help them get it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. Stay healthy, stay safe, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everybody.
Brad. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Brad.